In a crowded New York courtroom, a respected physician stood trial for a murder meant to be impossible to prove. He had engineered a flawless deception to secure his place among the untouchable elite, a crime so perfect it entirely mimicked natural death. His undoing would not come from a smoking gun, but from a single drop of liquid and a live cat brought to the witness stand. It was a spectacle that changed forensic science forever. If historical true crime stories are the kind you enjoy, a like and a subscription would mean a great deal. To understand the murder that would eventually unravel in that 1893 courtroom, you must first understand the city that nurtured it. New York in the 1890s was a metropolis intoxicated by its own prosperity, an era defined by aggressive industrial expansion that history would later come to call the Gilded Age. It was a time of immense, almost incomprehensible accumulation, where the avenues were lined with the sprawling limestone palaces of industrialists, and the grand ballrooms overflowed with silk and diamonds imported from across oceans. The aesthetic of the city was one of absolute, uncompromising refinement, but the gilding was only a thin layer of gold, masking a foundation of iron, sweat, and ruthlessness. The divide between those inside the warm, gaslit parlors and those outside in the freezing streets was not merely physical. It was an absolute fracture in reality. By 1896, the economist Charles Spar published an estimate stating that a mere 1% of the population had consolidated control over 51% of the total wealth of the United States. This unprecedented concentration of capital created a new American aristocracy, a class of citizens who operated under the quiet, unshakable assumption that their fortunes elevated them above the reach of mortal consequence. Wealth in this specific New York was not just currency used to purchase goods. It was a shield, a heavy armor that rendered its wearers largely immune to the moral and legal constraints that governed the masses in the slums below. The elite believed themselves entirely above the law, and for the most part, the courts and the police forces of the era agreed with them. Dr. Robert Buchanan understood this architecture of power better than most, and the understanding fostered a desperate, consuming hunger within him. He was a physician of some skill, a man who possessed the education and the refined manners required to mingle with the upper echelons of society, but who fundamentally lacked the inherited capital to truly belong among them. He operated a modest medical practice in the city, moving carefully through the periphery of the wealthy, observing their indulgences and their careless spending with a sharp, calculating eye. His ambition was not simply professional success or the quiet comfort of a middle-class life. It was a profound, aching desire to climb the social ladder, to cross the velvet ropes, and take a permanent seat at the tables where the true masters of the city dined. He needed an entry fee, a sum of money large enough to purchase the illusion of pedigree. He found that entry fee in the person of Anna Sutherland. She was a woman of substantial means, possessing a massive liquid fortune that could easily rival the accounts of the established elite. However, her wealth carried a heavy, unmentionable stain. Anna had not inherited her money from shipping lines, real estate, or railroads. She had amassed it through the highly profitable operation of high-end brothels in Newark and New York. Despite her immense bank accounts and her elegant dresses, the respectable parlors of Fifth Avenue remained firmly closed to a woman with her history. She possessed the exact financial leverage Buchanan lacked, and she lacked the exact social cover he could provide. She was aging, increasingly isolated by her reputation, and profoundly desperate for the one commodity her money had not yet been able to buy: societal respectability. Their union was, therefore, not a matter of romance but a cold, precisely negotiated marriage of convenience. By taking his name, Anna Sutherland was instantly transformed into the respectable wife of a medical professional, the dark chapters of her past discreetly overwritten by his clean, professional title. In exchange, Dr. Robert Buchanan was granted unfettered access to her sprawling estate, securing the immense capital he required to finally live the life he felt he deserved. It was a perfect symmetry of need, a silent contract signed at the altar where status was traded directly for fortune. They moved into a handsome residence, playing the parts of the distinguished physician and his wealthy bride for an audience of society watchers. But a marriage built on a transaction only lasts until one party decides the price is too high. The quiet arrangement they had forged at the altar did not survive the turning of the seasons. Once the ink had dried on the legal documents that wedded them, Dr. Robert Buchanan found himself in possession of a fortune that exceeded his most fevered ambitions, and he proceeded to spend it with the reckless entitlement of a man who believed it had always been his due. The modest physician vanished, replaced by a caricature of Gilded Age excess. He ordered tailored suits from the finest European fabrics, dined at restaurants where the bill equaled a laborer's yearly wage, and moved through the city not as a healer, but as a newly minted aristocrat. Anna Sutherland, confined to the handsome residence her money had purchased, watched the rapid hemorrhage of her capital with a growing, cold clarity. She had bought a husband to secure respectability, but she soon realized she had merely funded a parasite. Buchanan's arrogance did not stop at financial indulgence. It extended into a blatant disregard for the very woman who financed it. He began to conduct his affairs openly, taking up with a younger woman and parading his infidelity through the social circles he now frequented. He assumed that Anna, given her own shadowed history in the brothels of Newark, would quietly accept the indignity of a wandering husband as the standard cost of her newly purchased social standing. He fundamentally miscalculated the nature of the woman he had married. Anna had not survived the brutal, unforgiving underworld of the city by being docile. When the rumors of his philandering reached her, she did not retreat into the weeping submission expected of a Victorian wife. Instead, she confronted him with the hardened fury of a businesswoman who recognized a bad investment. The arguments that echoed through their home were vicious, culminating in a single, devastating ultimatum. Anna declared her intention to contact her attorneys and rewrite her will, threatening to cut Buchanan out of her estate entirely and leave him with nothing but the clothes his tailor had just delivered. For Buchanan, the threat was not merely a matter of losing luxury. It was an existential terror. A divorce or a public disinheritance would mean total, irrevocable ruin. The high society that had just begun to accept him would instantly close its doors, discarding him as a scandalous footnote. He would be forced to return to the grim, grinding reality of his former life, his reputation in ruins, his medical practice permanently tainted by the public humiliation. The Gilded Age did not forgive those who fell from grace, and Buchanan knew the pavement at the bottom was entirely unforgiving. Staring into the abyss of his impending poverty, the doctor reached a quiet, inevitable conclusion. Anna could not be allowed to visit her attorneys, and she could not simply be divorced. She had to die. However, intending murder and executing it were entirely different matters, especially for a man of science operating in the closing years of the 19th century. Buchanan was acutely aware of the advancements being made in the coroner's offices across the country. He knew that the crude methods of the past would no longer suffice. Standard poisons, the traditional tools of the domestic murderer, were now little more than a guaranteed path to the gallows. Arsenic left its metallic signature in the hair and bones. Strychnine induced terrifying, unmistakable convulsions that any competent medical examiner would immediately recognize. Heavy metals lingered in the tissues, waiting patiently to testify against the hands that administered them. If he were to kill her, he could not use the blunt instruments of the common criminal. He needed a medical masterpiece, a crime of such profound subtlety that it would pass seamlessly through the scrutiny of his own peers. He required a chemical symphony that would mimic the exact pathology of a natural, unavoidable death, a fatal event that the attending physicians would document as a tragic act of God, rather than the calculated malice of a husband. He needed to strike at the delicate machinery of her body without leaving a single fingerprint on the gears. He turned to his medical bags, looking for an invisible weapon, In the unpredictable, shifting weather of April 1892, the imposing walls of the Buchanan residence enclosed a sudden and violent medical crisis. Anna Sutherland, previously a woman of formidable constitution, who had survived the harshest realities of the city's underworld, was struck down by an illness that ravaged her nervous system with terrifying speed. Dr. Robert Buchanan did not quietly watch her fade in the isolation of their bedroom. He understood instinctively that a solitary, unwitnessed death would invite the exact legal scrutiny he desperately needed to avoid. Instead, he orchestrated a flawless, highly theatrical display of matrimonial devotion and sheer panic. He paced the heavy carpeted hallways, wringing his hands in apparent despair, and immediately dispatched urgent messengers into the city streets to summon a panel of esteemed independent physicians to her bedside. By inviting the upper echelons of the medical establishment into his home, he was not seeking a miraculous cure for his dying wife, but rather securing an unimpeachable aristocratic audience for his alibi. The attending physicians arrived promptly to find a grim and rapidly deteriorating scene. The patient was already slipping into a profound, unshakable coma, entirely unresponsive to their voices or physical stimuli. Her breathing was heavy, labored and unnaturally deep, echoing through the opulent, shadowed bedroom with a rhythmic, mechanical distress. To the highly trained eyes of the visiting doctors, the clinical presentation was immediately alarming and pointed toward a very specific, common pathology of the era. The stertorous breathing and the deep comatose state were the classic, undeniable textbook hallmarks of severe opioid poisoning. They quietly formed the unified suspicion that the wealthy woman had ingested a fatal overdose of morphine, a substance readily available, frequently prescribed, and tragically abused in the velvet-draped parlors of the Gilded Age. To confirm this grave, unspoken suspicion, the physicians relied on the undisputed cornerstone of 19th-century toxicology. The definitive clinical tell for acute morphine poisoning was an immediate and severe constriction of the pupils, a condition that rendered them as small as pinpoints, regardless of the ambient light. The senior doctor leaned closely over the unconscious woman, gently peeling back her eyelids to observe the reaction of her pupils to the flickering glow of the bedside gas lamp. It was in this precise, silent moment of examination that Buchanan's calculated genius fully manifested. The panel of experts stared into Anna's eyes and found that her pupils were completely normal, perhaps even slightly dilated. The observation entirely contradicted their initial, confident diagnosis. In the rigid, uncompromising medical logic of 1892, a patient simply could not die of a massive morphine overdose without exhibiting the telltale pinpoint pupils. Confronted with this physiological impossibility, the esteemed panel of doctors immediately retreated from their suspicions of foul play or accidental overdose. They rationalized the deep coma and the heavy breathing through the only other logical medical avenue available to them, officially declaring the cause of her impending death to be a severe cerebral hemorrhage, a natural and unavoidable stroke brought on by age and internal strain. Anna Sutherland succumbed to her mysterious illness shortly thereafter, passing away under the watchful, utterly deceived eyes of New York's finest medical men. Buchanan buried his wife with an appropriate, beautifully calibrated display of muted solemnity. He swiftly moved to execute the terms of her newly preserved will, inheriting the entirety of her massive estate without a single legal challenge or whispered doubt from the authorities. His arrogance swelled so rapidly in the aftermath of his success that merely days after the funeral, while the mourning wreaths were still fresh on the door, he brazenly moved his younger mistress directly into the marital home. The perfect crime had been executed precisely as he had designed it in the quiet, isolated confines of his laboratory. He had successfully bypassed the scrutiny of the law by deliberately blinding the men of science. As the New York Times archives would later document, when the unbelievable truth finally surfaced in 1893, Buchanan had not simply poisoned his wife. He had engineered a brilliant chemical paradox. He had administered a lethal dose of morphine to guarantee her death, but he had concurrently laced the fatal draft with a precise, calculated measure of belladonna, a toxic plant extract containing atropine. The lethal morphine forced the pupillary sphincter to violently constrict, while the belladonna forced the exact same muscle to wildly dilate. When mixed in the exact, terrible proportions Buchanan had painstakingly formulated, the two opposing toxins fought each other to a perfect invisible standstill within the victim's nervous system. The result was a set of flawlessly normal pupils in a dying woman. It was a genius, diabolical calculation that weaponized the very textbooks of his colleagues against them, seamlessly transforming a brutal, premeditated murder into an undisputed act of nature. If there is a fatal flaw in the architecture of the perfect crime, it is almost always the sheer, unmanageable ego of the architect. Dr. Robert Buchanan had successfully deceived the finest medical minds in New York and secured a sprawling fortune that elevated him entirely beyond the reach of consequence. Yet the quiet, private satisfaction of a hidden victory was not enough for him. He required an audience to appreciate his brilliance. In the weeks following the elaborate funeral, fueled by the intoxicating combination of his newfound wealth and expensive liquor, Buchanan began to frequent local establishments and talk far too much. Amidst the clinking glasses and heavy cigar smoke of a crowded bar, he carelessly boasted to acquaintances about the profound ignorance of the city's investigators, detailing with a chilling precision exactly how simple it would be for a scientifically skilled physician to commit murder and walk away entirely undetected. It was a spectacular display of Gilded Age arrogance, an assumption of total invulnerability, and it did not go unnoticed. Investigative journalists at the New York World, a ruthless publication thriving on exposing the sensational scandals of the upper crust, caught wind of the doctor's morbid bragging. They quickly connected his barroom hypotheticals to the sudden, highly convenient demise of his wealthy wife and the shockingly rapid installation of his younger mistress into the stately marital home. The newspaper began to publish a series of pointed, relentless questions, igniting a fierce media frenzy that gripped the city and systematically shattered the quiet protection Buchanan's money had previously guaranteed him. The public outcry grew so deafening that the local police and the district attorney, who traditionally preferred to leave the domestic affairs of the wealthy quietly unexamined, were politically forced into action. Exactly 43 days after Anna Sutherland had been sealed in her heavy casket and lowered into the earth, the authorities ordered her grave opened. Her decaying remains were exhumed from the dark soil and transported under heavy guard to a sterile laboratory, suddenly shifting the battleground of the case from the elegant parlors of high society to the cold, unforgiving realm of the autopsy table. To navigate this grim frontier, the state called upon Professor Victor Vaughan, a distinguished chemist from the University of Michigan and a pioneering figure in the nascent, highly complex field of early forensic toxicology. Professor Vaughan was presented with a gruesome and monumental scientific task, requiring him to sift for invisible clues through human tissues that had been quietly decomposing in the damp earth for over a month and a half. The process of isolating volatile alkaloids from corrupted remains in the late 19th century was an agonizingly slow, methodical procedure, involving dangerous chemical solvents, endless rounds of purification, and days of silent, careful observation in a fume-filled laboratory. After weeks of exhaustive testing, Vaughan's relentless diligence yielded a definitive physical result. He successfully isolated distinct, undeniable traces of morphine within the exhumed organs. However, the scientific discovery did not deliver the swift, crushing justice that the public demanded. Buchanan had anticipated every legal variable, and his highly paid, formidable defense team immediately moved to neutralize the toxicologist's findings. The defense lawyers eloquently argued to the court that the extracted morphine was not a clandestine murder weapon, but rather a standard, compassionate medicine legally and openly administered by the panel of attending physicians during Anna's final hours of physical distress. To cement their argument, they pointed triumphantly back to the sworn medical records of those very doctors, reminding everyone that the dying woman possessed perfectly normal, even slightly dilated pupils, a physiological fact that, according to every established medical textbook of the era, absolutely proved that morphine was not the fatal agent. The prosecution found themselves trapped in a brilliant, devastating medical paradox engineered by a man who knew the law's blind spots intimately. To hang a wealthy doctor, the prosecution needed to prove the impossible, that two poisons had been used to hide each other, and they had to prove it to a jury of laymen. When the trial of Dr. Robert Buchanan formally opened in the spring of 1893, the New York courtroom was instantly transformed into the most exclusive theater in the city. The heavy wooden galleries were packed tightly with the silk-clad elite of the Gilded Age, men and women of immense wealth who had arrived not merely to witness a legal proceeding, but to watch one of their own fiercely defend the boundaries of their privileged existence. Buchanan sat at the defense table projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence, entirely convinced that the fortress of his medical deception would hold against the crude machinery of the law. His defense attorneys constructed a brilliant, seemingly impenetrable wall of reasonable doubt built entirely upon the sworn testimonies of the esteemed physicians who had attended Anna Sutherland's deathbed. The defense repeatedly hammered upon a singular, undisputed medical axiom of the 19th century, emphasizing to the jury that a fatal overdose of morphine universally resulted in the violent constriction of the pupils. They paraded the original doctors before the court, forcing them to publicly reiterate that the dying woman's pupils had remained perfectly normal, effectively rendering the prosecution's theory of morphine poisoning a clinical impossibility. It was a formidable legal strategy that relied entirely on the era's established medical literature, creating a powerful illusion of innocence that seemed poised to set the wealthy physician free. To dismantle this carefully constructed defense, the prosecution understood that abstract chemical theories and complex laboratory reports would never be sufficient to sway a jury of laymen. They needed a demonstration so visceral and undeniable that it could shatter the arrogant certainty of the medical establishment and the high society looking down from the gallery. They called Professor Victor Vaughan to the witness stand, shifting the burden of proof from the realm of legal rhetoric to the cold, empirical theater of scientific experimentation. The distinguished toxicologist did not ascend the steps holding mere stacks of paper or glass vials filled with cloudy liquids. Instead, the courtroom descended into a stunned, confused silence as Vaughan entered carrying a live cat, placing the animal carefully upon the polished wood of the witness stand. The collective breath of the gallery caught as the professor produced a small medical dropper containing a meticulously refined chemical extract, a fluid harvested directly from the decomposed stomach lining of the exhumed victim. It was a moment entirely unprecedented in American legal history, a bizarre and highly tense convergence of biology and jurisprudence, where the ultimate fate of a privileged murderer rested upon the biological reactions of a small feline, under the intense, unblinking gaze of the judge, the jury, and the wealthy spectators. Professor Vaughan gently held the animal and squeezed a single drop of the toxicological extract directly into the cat's eye. The courtroom waited in absolute, suffocating stillness, watching the animal's face with a morbid fascination. Slowly, steadily, and then with a shocking, undeniable clarity, the pupil of the cat's treated eye began to massively dilate, expanding outward until it nearly consumed the entire colored iris. The physical evidence was stark, immediate, and utterly devastating to the defense's carefully woven narrative. Vaughan turned to the jury and methodically explained the underlying chemistry of Buchanan's diabolical recipe. He testified that while the morphine had successfully suppressed the victim's nervous system and caused her death, the belladonna mixed into the fatal draught was a far more resilient chemical compound. one that survived the grim processes of bodily decomposition much longer than the opiate it was designed to mask. The atropine within the belladonna had patiently waited in the damp earth for 43 days, retaining its powerful, characteristic ability to force a pupil wide open. This single, dramatic biological reaction in the courtroom perfectly mirrored the sinister chemical warfare that had taken place within Anna Sutherland's body, effectively proving that the two poisons had been expertly layered to hide each other. The brilliant, undeniable visual evidence instantly dissolved the defense's entire foundation of reasonable doubt, transforming their esteemed medical witnesses from pillars of truth into unwitting pawns of a master manipulator. In that defining moment, the impenetrable shield of wealth and social standing that Dr. Robert Buchanan had so ruthlessly murdered to obtain was violently pierced by the sharp, objective edge of early forensic science. The Gilded Age illusion of aristocratic invulnerability was abruptly shattered, leaving a desperate, exposed killer sitting in the dock, finally stripped of his medical camouflage and forced to confront the cold reality of his own engineered ruin. The jury did not require a lengthy deliberation after witnessing the irrefutable biological evidence presented directly before their eyes. The elaborate, highly sophisticated medical camouflage that Dr. Robert Buchanan had so meticulously constructed over months of planning was entirely dismantled in a single afternoon, leaving nothing behind but the raw, exposed reality of his calculated greed. He was officially found guilty of the premeditated murder of Anna Sutherland in the first degree. The arrogant physician, who had so desperately and ruthlessly sought a permanent, respected seat among the untouchable elite of high society, found his final destination instead within the damp, unforgiving stone walls of Sing Sing prison. In the summer of 1895, the state carried out its ultimate sentence. Buchanan was strapped into the heavy oak of the newly implemented electric chair, paying with his own life for a crime he had once boasted was completely undetectable by modern authorities. His execution marked the definitive, brutal end of his desperate social climb. However, the legacy of his trial extended far beyond the execution chamber, leaving an indelible, permanent mark upon the American justice system. The Buchanan verdict stood as a monumental watershed moment in the annals of both legal and medical history. It was the very first time in an American court of law that the complex, deliberate toxicological masking of one deadly poison by another had been successfully identified, scientifically explained, and definitively proven to a panel of laymen. The courtroom spectacle laid bare a profound and unsettling contrast regarding the inherent duality of scientific knowledge during the rapid industrialization of the late 19th century. On one side of the ledger stood a licensed healer, a trusted physician who had completely perverted his extensive medical training, weaponizing his intimate understanding of human anatomy to extinguish a vulnerable life simply to secure an unearned financial windfall. On the exact opposite side stood men like Professor Victor Vaughan, dedicated chemists and pioneering toxicologists who utilized those exact same scientific principles not to inflict harm, but to reach across the dark threshold of the grave and allow the violently silenced victims to finally speak their truth to the living. Ultimately, the forgotten tragedy of Anna Sutherland and the spectacular public fall of her husband served as a dark, perfect reflection of the exact era that had produced them both. The Gilded Age was fundamentally defined by a powerful, insulated class of men who operated under the quiet, unshakable conviction that their immense accumulation of capital rendered them practically immortal, shielding them entirely from the moral constraints and legal consequences that governed ordinary, impoverished lives. By perfectly mimicking a natural stroke and smoothly inheriting a massive fortune, without raising a single immediate alarm, Dr. Robert Buchanan had very nearly proved them right. He had successfully bypassed the local police, thoroughly deceived the established medical authorities of New York, and purchased the aristocratic illusion he so deeply craved. But in the end, it was not the inherently flawed, easily manipulated machinery of human law that finally brought him to justice. It was the cold, indifferent, and undeniable truth of chemistry. The silent, inevitable reactions of molecules and alkaloids trapped in the dark earth cared absolutely nothing for a man's elevated social standing, his expensive tailored suits, or the overwhelming balance of his bank accounts. Science simply demanded the truth, and in doing so, it dragged the untouchable elite back down to the common dirt from which they had tried so desperately to rise.